did it to keep as much audience as possible. Anybody who was anybody would want to stay here this panel. So kudos to you guys for being smart enough to stay. I do have one correction to the program, which is that the fellow who was originally going to be the moderator, Dan Bowling, great guy, couldn't come due to a family situation. So in his place, we have Fatima Ruth, my colleague, who's a wonderful person, and also, like Mike Keegan, specializes in immigration and refugee kinds of issues, but she's agreed to moderate. And she was confused when Fatima stood up, it didn't look like Dan. So, without further ado, thank you.
Hi everyone. So this is our panel on lawyer well-being, which I'm sure is a subject near and dear to our hearts. And we're very lucky to have speakers from a range of interdisciplinary perspectives on this law, ranging from law to psychology to education and technology. And I think you're going to hear some very interesting, probing insights into how we can be happy, how it makes us happy as professors, as law students, as practicing lawyers. Abe Lincoln said most people are as happy as they make up their minds to be, and I think a lot of modern developments in neuroscience and other fields really take that to another level. So I'm very excited to introduce our first speaker, Nancy Levitt, who's going to talk about creating happy lawyers. She holds a curator's professorship and has the Edward Ellison Professorship at the University of Missouri Kansas City School of Law. She's won numerous teaching awards and authored several books, including most recently The Happy Lawyer, Making a Good Life in the Law, and The Good Lawyer, Seeking Quality in the Practice of Law. So please welcome Nancy.
Good afternoon. I just want to add my voice to the chorus of thanks for this galvanizing and intriguing conference. It's one of the best I've attended in 24 years. I began I also want to thank you hardy souls who have stayed until the last panel. There are a lot of myths about happy lawyers. The first myth, of course, is that there aren't any. There are actually quite a few happy lawyers. Relative to other occupations, we are roughly in the middle of the pack. Now, lawyers don't like to be in the middle of the pack for much of anything. We tend to like decisive victories. Let us come out on top, or at least let us win the race to the bottom. The thesis of my presentation is that law schools could offer much more direct training in the intersection of law and psychology in ways that would promote both good and happy lawyering. In the first part, I'll cover briefly some of the most important tools law professors can give to students so they can control their own happiness. Much of this centers on metacognition, the ability to think self-reflectively, which is what Deborah dives in deep to. In the second part, I'll draw from Doug Linder's in my second book, To the Happy Lawyer, called The Good Lawyer, and shameless advertising. This will be published by Oxford in May. Lawyer well-being starts with talking to law students up front during orientation about happiness. Just as we talk about the rigors of law school and the expected stress, remind them to eat their vegetables, get a life, and affirmatively do things that will make them happier. Remember the positive affirmations before test taking? I know it's a little reminiscent of SNL's Stuart Smalley, but it works. Apply the same principles to embarking on law school. Perhaps the most important message for students is to carve your own path and define success for yourself. Too often students think their worth is measured by grades. I'm not saying grades are unimportant, just that happiness shouldn't be defined by grades. One of the most important series of studies in the happiness literature has to do with perspectives. Researchers conducted interviews and surveys with Olympic medalists, and they made a surprising discovery. The bronze medalists were almost uniformly more satisfied in life than the silver medalists. The silver medalists for the rest of their lives looked upward in comparison, just a few seconds less and I would have had the gold, while the bronze medalists looked downward. Hey, I made it onto the medal stand. People are so much happier if they make downward rather than upward comparisons in life, and law school seems to gear people toward making upward comparisons. It is so easy to step onto the institutional glide path, and in the law school context, the brass rings are top grades, law review board membership, and joining a large firm. Why is that path so seductive? in part because it's tied to higher salaries. This is a chart of starting salaries, the bimodal distribution. You can handle numbers by now, the double hump camel, with very few associates earning very high salaries, other people thinking they're failures if they aren't earning the most money. That's one of the most pervasive and pernicious myths, that a high-paying law job leads to happiness. On the whole, money doesn't have a lot to do with happiness. Absolute income doesn't matter a great deal to lawyer satisfaction, at least above $75,000 a year. For people earning at least that much, which $75,000 is almost exactly the median for lawyer salaries in this country, while more money might affect their perceptions of their own success, wouldn't have much effect on their day-to-day happiness. But relative income does matter. Far more important for lawyers is how their salaries compare to people whom they perceive as their peers. Attorneys are very concerned with keeping up with the Joneses, or in our case, the Jones Days. People care a lot about what other people are earning relative to themselves. In fact, economists find that people care more about earning more than the people around them than they care about what they make in absolute terms. The other part of the glide path problem is that working for a large law firm is held out to be the pinnacle of success and therefore happiness. According to numerous surveys and attested to by attrition rates, among the least happy lawyers are associates who work for big law firms. 40% of associates leave by the third year, 60% by the fifth year of practice. The high billable hour requirements, the bureaucracy, the sheer bigness. There are difficulties with large firms simply by virtue of their size. Practice groups, they can help create little enclaves, but you just don't get that cheers feeling of everybody knowing your name, and your future may be controlled by a remote committee of players, many of whom you don't know. Now, I want to emphasize something. Big law isn't bad law. For certain students, it's exactly the right choice. Some of us enjoyed our time in large firms, and some students, it's the right choice, but I want to emphasize that it's not the right choice for everybody, and students shouldn't be thinking big or bust. So where are the happy lawyers? I'm glad you asked. Among the happiest lawyers are those who work with clients whose values they share, attorneys who work at small or medium-sized firms, or in the public sector, particularly in public interest jobs. New lawyers entering legal service jobs may earn just a third of large firm pay, but what made them happy was that their work aligned with their values. They made downward, not upward comparisons in life. They work with people who are less fortunate than they are. You can give law students tools to help them create their own happiness. The toolbox. The qualities that seem to matter most to people being happy are control, mattering, work aligning with values, relationships, and resilience, on which Rob is going to go deep on. Control, mattering, and aligning work and values. We break these out separately in the book, but they're interrelated. One is the degree of control within the job, which is somewhat self-explanatory. Autonomy, freedom to structure your day, doing the things you like to do. An aspect of workplace control that's a little more subtle is believing that your contribution matters. If anyone offers you a job where no one's fortunes and no one's well-being depends on what you do not take that job, you will not be happy. There's a study about people in nursing homes who are asked to take care of this plant. It's your job to water this plant. Controlling for other variables, like the all-important one of pre-existing health conditions, those patients who were put in charge of a plant for several months had half the death rate of people who weren't asked to tend a plant. People like their work when they have a sense that what they do matters. Mattering matters. Second, it's about the people. Tell students to look for jobs where they like the people with whom they'll work. According to one happiness expert, about 70% of our controllable happiness stems from relationships. The primary thing that really matters in people's lives are other people, and working with people you like and trust cannot be overvalued. If you can find a playful office, or at least the office where the lawyer's senses of humor did not become vestigial organs during law school, bonus points. Second, tell students that happiness is contagious and they can catch it. Find happier people. Pardon?
Can't hear you.
Mic just went off. Back on? Or no?
Yes.
Yes?
Yes.
Find the happier people. No? Still can't hear.
It might be a battery.
Not the batteries. All right, I'm going to try to speak up, all right? How are you doing way in the back row? other people around them, as Bill Black told us yesterday. Don't have a Debbie Downer in your law school class or on your faculty. Sure you do. The person who gleefully finds the negative in any situation and then tries to infect you. But disgruntled law students and lawyers can spread their unhappiness like cold germs. You probably also have the bubbly and upbeat Paul Positive too. I know Colorado does. Studies in organizational behavior show that his positive mood will transfer between people and spread throughout a group. Third, be good. This is really where the second book comes in. We presented evidence in The Happy Lawyer that for most lawyers, greater career satisfaction was both possible and within their own power to grasp. In the process of researching and writing that book, we were struck by the strong link between career satisfaction and doing good work. When we interviewed 200 lawyers across the country and asked them what made them happy, almost to a person, they spoke about times when they accomplished great results for clients whom they cared about. The psychological literature amply supports this idea that doing good work leads to the development of enduring well-being and satisfaction. As my friend Corey says, being good by doing good. A central premise of the good lawyer is that by working toward becoming a better lawyer, by paying attention to the quality of your work, you also work on yourself and you gain satisfaction. Of course, there's no one path to becoming a lawyer. Each lawyer has to carve his or her way up the mountain. In the book, we talk about avoiding heuristic pitfalls, the cognitive skills, such as confirmation bias, anchoring, mental blind spots, predictionary, that Randy Kaiser and Andrew Perlman have already discussed with you. The book already covers courage, empathy, other foundational qualities of good lawyering. I'm going to focus on just one characteristic. That one characteristic is just an example, is willpower and a growth mindset. More than most jobs, lawyers make a lot of decisions requiring conscientious and sustained thought, cognitive overload, Catherine O'Brady's good term. That requires willpower. The importance of willpower escapes most people. Researchers who surveyed more than 1 million people around the world found that self-control was ranked dead last among 20 listed character strengths, trailing virtues such as humor, modesty, and creativity. Interestingly, when those same 1 million people were asked to rate their failings, lack of self-control came out at the very top of the list. Yay, Gene again. Robert Pirsig, in Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, used the word gumption to describe the feelings of initiative that make persistence or sustained action in the face of challenges possible. Emily's going to delve deeply into this, and I believe she uses the term grit. Gumption does for a person what powdered milk biscuits, Prairie Home Companions' longtime imaginary sponsor promises. It gives a person the strength to get up and do what needs to be done. You know the importance of willpower. The late 1960s, Stanford psychologist Walter Mischel conducted the marshmallow study, the first study that suggested that willpower might be the most important measure of a successful life or career. And you know the outcome of this one, right? Mischel tracked down the hundreds of subjects in the marshmallow study and see how they fared in school or in life, and the 4-year-olds who managed to resist the marshmallow for the full 15 minutes scored an average of 210 points higher on SAT tests than those who caved in the first 30 seconds. In short, willpower, the key to a successful life. A proven route to avoid the feelings of helplessness that are so destructive of willpower is to adopt what Stanford psychologist Carol Dweck has dubbed the growth mindset. Her term for a belief or habit that's been proven to contribute both to better learning and success on the job. A person with a growth mindset values his experience regardless of the outcome. Life isn't about primarily winning or losing, it's about working on things that matter. Satisfaction comes from charting paths, working hard, feeling you've done your best. When people with growth mindsets believe that their basic qualities are things they cultivate through their own efforts, people with the opposite mindset, a fixed mindset, believe their abilities are inherent and can't be changed. They face a future of self-doubt, anxiety, and limited achievement. Two mindsets are, of course, an oversimplification, but it provides, the model does, a useful way of thinking about how to become a more effective lawyer. It's possible to change mindsets because, of course, a mindset is just a set of beliefs. Simply knowing the existence of a growth mindset can sort of lift the shackles of someone who has a fixed mindset. Willpower, like so many other traits, is contagious. Hanging around people who have lots of willpower gives you a boost of willpower. There's new material coming out in cognitive neuroscience about building neural pathways with repeated patterns of action. Good neural pathways are bad. Think repetitive worry and depression. Let me ask you a quick question. Have any of you ever played the video game Tetris? The one where shapes fall from the screen, you create the unbroken line across the bottom. The studies are fascinating. The people who repeatedly play Tetris, when they leave the game, they go outside and you see the cereal boxes falling, the bricks falling, and researchers call this the Tetris effect, but of course it's not just about video gaming. The point is you start seeing the framework of the world according to the framework of what you typically do. Todd Peterson has a great line. Repeated actions over a period of time create new neural pathways in the brain, which create channels the mind has a tendency to follow repetitively. How can you create the good pathways? There are lots of little things you can do. One of my favorites is the 3 gratitudes exercise from Sonia Lyubomirsky. At the end of the day, although not every day because it then becomes a chore, write down 3 things for which you're grateful. I'm really grateful for having such a terrific colleague and writing partner as Doug. I am incredibly grateful for everything I've learned from all of you. I'm very grateful that most of you seem interested in the concepts of our books, or at least you're a civil and polite group. I'm grateful either way. To tell students that they can create good neural pathways. Finally, expect change and develop resilience. Life is filled with lots of moments. Some are happy, some are sad, some are stressful. The goal of achieving happiness every waking minute is totally unrealistic. Tell law students to expect the bad. Most people, maybe especially law students and lawyers who've been overachievers their whole lives, will tend to underestimate the probability that they will experience negative events, right? The optimism bias run wild. 85% of your students will change jobs more than once in their legal career. Only 15% of them, if national averages apply, will hold the same job at mid-career that they had at graduation. The average is to change jobs about 3 times. Develop resilience. Psychologist George Valent did one of the longest longitudinal studies relating to happiness. He began by studying a class of healthy Harvard sophomores from the 1940s and followed them for almost 70 years. There was some turnover among researchers. One of the key findings of the study was that folks who had happier lives had developed the ability to put things in perspective and to bounce back after disappointment. Valent concluded that the ability to develop mature adaptations to setbacks was the single best predictor of a successful life and a happy life. Here's the thought I will leave you with to tell your students. Tell them not to try to be happy 100% of the time. They will fail. More than that, they won't take risks. They won't realize their potential. Comedian Conan O'Brien, being serious for a moment, ended his commencement address at his alma mater with a wish to the students that they would take risks and experience both times of happiness and times of sadness. And he said, "So that's what I wish for all of you, the bad as well as the good. Fall down, make a mess, break something occasionally, and remember, the story is never over." Thank you.
All right, our next speaker is Dr. Rob Durr, PhD in psychology. He's at Northwestern University, where he is a cross-appointment in the law school and counseling and psychological services. He specializes in emotional intelligence, mindfulness, and positive psychology for law courses, and has introduced new courses in those areas.
Hello. I have a loud enough voice. I probably don't need to be back here. I'm so used to doing workshops with lawyers and law students that I may walk around a little bit and kind of a workshop feel to this. So thanks for that. I'm Rob Durr, and as you know now, I'm a psychologist at Northwestern. And I'm so glad to be here. I've really been looking forward to coming down here. It had nothing to do with the weather. Chicago has been so beautiful all winter, single digits for the last couple months. Actually, I just walked around outside. I hadn't been outside in like 4 months before today. And like Nancy, thanks so much for sticking around too. I know it's the end of 2 long days, 2 great days I've been really honored to be a part of. And I figured with a group of lawyers in the Vegas Strip just down the street that I didn't know what kind of numbers we would have. I thought it might be down to just 2 or 3 of you, so I'm really glad some of you are still here. I also just want to say I feel so honored to be on this panel as so kind of early in my career, really at the beginning of diving into understanding law students and lawyers and getting into creating this as a niche and understanding what happens in the law school experience that leads to the really high rates of clinical anxiety and mood issues that I'm going to talk about just a little bit. So these are the people that I've learned from and have been reading about, reading their work, and so it's an honor to be on this panel. I wanted to start first just talking a little bit about my position at Northwestern, because I think it really is a good example of how these two fields are working together and what Northwestern Law School is doing to use, to really use psychology to help address the mental health, high prevalence of mental health issues that we see in law school. 3 years ago, they decided they wanted to have their own in-house clinical psychologist to provide individual therapy for the students and sort of act as an in-house law school psychologist providing consultation. So I really do 3 primary things. I provide extensive consultation to senior staff and administrators and faculty. Some of that is on doing exactly what we've been doing at this conference, thinking about new and innovative ways to develop interpersonal skills, communication, emotional intelligence, talking to clinical faculty about how to integrate that into their clinic and classes. And then a majority of my week is spent providing individual therapy. So I spend about 15 to 20 hours a week sitting across from law students struggling in their law classes. I'm going to talk today really with my clinical cap on about anecdotally what I've learned over the last 2 years and even before that at the University of Denver working with law students. And then the third thing I do is I offer what I call wellness and performance enhancement programs. And I really think of those as kind of 2 separate but interrelated areas of programming that I do at Northwestern. The performance enhancement is kind of making a case and selling the fact that these soft skills that it seems like everyone here really values have hard value in a legal career. So emotional intelligence, communication skills, and then the wellness having to do with addressing mood and anxiety and kind of what we think about in terms of being a happier lawyer. So that's a little bit of what I do, and hopefully that gives you a sense of just what's happening out there beyond maybe what you're seeing at your school in terms of these fields working together. So I really want to just spend very briefly at first highlight the problem with what I see as the problem in mental health issues in the law, and then also briefly talk about the rise in anxiety and other psychological issues as partly a resilience issue. Tell you about what resilience is, again, very briefly. We don't have time to go really in depth about it. And then tell you a little bit about how I'm using positive psychology as a way to really address this resilience issue. So this is from Larry Krieger, who I think everyone I've talked to mentioned him at one point or another. One thing that's been striking me is how little good empirical data there is out there about how bad is the problem. In terms of mental health of law students and lawyers, what are we really looking at? Martin Seligman, who there's going to be some real themes that you hear on our panel. His name is obviously one of them. Produced some work, but Larry Krieger and Ken Sheldon, who's at Mizzou, I'm sure a lot of you know him too, produced some of this data. So obviously it's a major concern. When I started to see why Northwestern would want to hire a clinical psychologist on staff and then saw these stats, I started to ask some questions. Is this right? Are lawyers this unhappy? Is the legal field as unhappy or unsatisfied as everyone's saying that they are? And then what's going on with lawyers? What's going on with law students? And that's really the majority of my week is spent sitting one-on-one with students thinking about that and trying to kind of wrap my head around that. And obviously we could spend a whole conference and a whole 2 or 3 days just talking about why there is mental health, the prevalence of mental health in law schools that there is. Today I wanted to make a case that one of the primary factors is resilience. We know a lot of the other ones, and we could spend time talking about each of those, like confused priorities that we see, like living an unbalanced life, how quick self-care kind of goes that first year, unrealistic or unhealthy attitudes, that shift in values that takes place from intrinsic to extrinsic right off the bat, law school becoming one's identity, But another key reason that there's such high mental health issues is this resilience issue. So resilience is a term that's received a lot of attention in psychological literature and also in education. I'm sure a lot of you have read some of Seligman's work and other people on resilience. Like most psychological constructs taken from clinical research, there are several definitions and constructs and models of resilience that you would see out there. So I just present a very simple definition here that I like, which is generally it's thought of as just the capacity to adapt successfully in the face of challenging or threatening circumstances. So being resilient doesn't mean going through life without experiencing stress or pain. As Nancy just pointed out a second ago, obviously if we have the expectation to always be happy or to erase stress, we'd be on the wrong track there. It's really more about when you face adversity, how you bounce back from that. So it's bouncing back from difficult experiences. Just an example or a little kind of story to highlight this. If we take two law students, I see this kind of this breakdown all the time in individual therapy. Let's say Jack and Gabe, who both went through the fall of their 2L year on-campus interview process without finding a summer associate position. Both went into a tailspin. They were sad, concerned that they didn't find a position for the summer after their second year, indecisive, anxious about the future. For Jack, the mood was transient. After 2 weeks, he told himself, it's not you, it's the economy going through a bad patch. I'm good at what I do, and there will be a market for my skills. He updated his resume and sent it to a dozen New York firms, all of which rejected him again. He then tried 6 companies in his Ohio hometown and eventually landed a position for the summer. Gabe, on the other hand, spiraled into hopelessness. I didn't get callbacks because I don't have what it takes, he thought, personalizing it. I'm not cut out for law, the economy will take years to recover. That sort of cycle of negative criticism, self-critical. And even after his career advisor gave him other ideas, he didn't look for another job. So Gabe and Jack stand at opposite ends of this continuum of resilience, about how they respond to this very difficult situation that's so common. Right now, the Jacks of the world bounce back after a brief period of malaise. Within a year, they've grown because of the experience. The Gabes go from sadness to depression to a paralyzing fear of the future. So we know that failure is inevitable, and that's why I've been focusing so much on the resilience issue with students. And there's a couple things that I've noticed that I think really contribute to it. Part of it right now is just the climate. I don't mean the weather, even though it's horrible in Chicago. Again, more to do with every one of these moments feels so big for law students. They feel like if they don't get that summer associate position, they're not going to get a job offer, their career is doomed. So the climate has kind of set the stage for things, the magnitude being really huge. And I really struggle with that with students. I mean, is that irrational to think that you're not in a bad place? In terms of cognitive therapy, that's one of the things that I think is really difficult. So the climate of value and self-sufficiency, kind of this rugged individualism that we see in America of, I can do it on my own. Alexithymia, for those of you that don't know, an inability to identify and express emotions. Many of our students really struggle with this. And I think Deborah's going to go into this more, potentially, if not, just a little bit about it, that lack of recognition of kind of the emotional mind and how we really have two minds, the intellectual and the emotional, and very little appreciation and value for emotional intelligence in the emotional mind. And then finally, never learning to fail. Yeah, we're really seeing that, that I'm sure several of you have read about. James Stigler, for example, a psychology professor at UCLA who's focused his research on learning throughout the world, has pointed out how troublesome that's been for education, that students haven't had a chance to learn how to fail, so therefore they haven't developed the skills that they need to bounce back. So that's a little bit about what I'm seeing, what resilience is, and what I've been doing about it is introducing positive psychology. So let me tell you just a little bit about that. We know it's the scientific study of optimal human functioning. Psychology kind of painted themselves into a dark corner for a number of years and led by Martin Seligman. It's really a focus on the characteristics and strengths of the individual to help them flourish. So it's really a burgeoning area of psychology that I think offers a lot of unique tools for law students. one of the things that's come out of it is what Sean Aker, who is a human potential expert consultant in this area. And by the way, if you don't know who Sean Aker is, I'd encourage you to watch his TEDx talk. He's one of the best positive psychologists that I know. What he talks about is the happiness advantage, which is just this idea that we've had the formula of success and happiness kind of flipped the wrong way for a long time. That we think if we just work hard, put our head down, continue to achieve and succeed, eventually we'll become happy. And what his research and others in this field has shown is that we need to flip that formula, that we've actually had it wrong for a number of years, that those who find happiness, who generate positive emotion in their life, do a lot of the things Nancy was just talking about in terms of mental habits, that we're going to have an edge over the competition and what he refers to as the happiness advantage, where we're able to achieve greater things in our life. So I've been applying positive psychology and this idea of the happiness advantage in a number of different areas. I started orientation, just like Nancy was saying, with introducing the PERMA model, which is Seligman's latest well-being theory, and talking about that. They gave me an hour and a half the first day of orientation to address the 1L JD class this year at Northwestern, and I think everyone was ready to run to the refund office when they saw a psychologist. They saw a clinical psychologist is on the itinerary for the first day. I had to start off saying it's not that bad. This is actually a good thing. We're here to talk about how to succeed and be happy and accomplish your goals. It's not as bad as it seems. But starting from day one, just having a built-in workshop where some focus that normalizes it from someone who can talk about it without scaring students, I think is something that's really helpful and really important. Also, focusing on what's called the explanatory style. And we just, an assistant dean of students and I just offered a workshop on how to respond to 1L grades. Grades after you get grades back at the beginning of your at the end of your first semester. And I incorporated what's called the explanatory style, which I'll tell you about in just a second, in 1 minute, and into that workshop. And then I've also been doing the three gratitude, or 3 blessings, as a lot of people refer to it, that Seligman and that Nancy was just referring to with students. And I do this in a number of different workshops. I've just started collecting some data on this and just offered one of the first classes ever that I call the Emotionally Intelligent Lawyer series. And in the first course, I collected happiness survey results on the subjective happiness scale. I'm going to be tracking students who are doing this and then sending out an email as a little follow-up to see. It's not gold standard design research yet. I hope to get to that point where I'm really breaking it into a control and experimental group and actually doing some interventions and seeing if they're effective in helping anxiety and mood throughout the 3 years. But at least it's going to provide some initial data sometime soon over the next year. I'm excited to look at that. I would encourage all of you to do this, as Nancy recommended as well, just to think about at the end of every day 3 things that are going well in your life. The students have been pretty receptive to it for the most part and have started to implement it into their life. The other thing I want to just mention briefly, and I just have 2 more slides. One is on what's called the explanatory style. How many of you have heard of this? This is pretty common, a lot of people know this, so 3 or 4 of you know. What this has to do with is that our definition of optimism versus pessimism is a lot deeper than just the glass is half full or half empty. It really has to do, and it relates so closely to resilience because it has to do with how we explain setbacks and successes in our life. And what we find is that a person with an optimistic explanatory style is said to explain the causes of negative events, like grades they weren't happy with or not getting a job through OCI, as external, unstable, and specific. So what this comes out of the learned helplessness theory from Seligman, and what it says is that there's 3 dimensions, 3 continuums that underlie optimism versus pessimism. Stable versus unstable. Do you think it's always going to happen? It's going to be, does it have to be the 3 Ps? Is it going to be permanent throughout your life? Global versus specific. Universal throughout one's life or specific to a part of one's life, or internal versus external. Then the last thing I was going to put up is just some simple mood boosts that I do with students all the time. And These are really accessible to all of you, I think, as law faculty in the academic journals that they were spending time teaching us about this morning, of how to access some of the academic work that's there. But I'll put up a slide just like this in workshops that I'm doing right now. And I usually have like 20 to 30 students come and I'll walk through these different exercises. So that's a little bit about resilience, a little bit about how I'm seeing the issue in law students' mental health issues, and what I'm doing as a clinical psychologist to really leverage the field of psychology to help address this issue. Thank you very much.
Our next speaker is Deborah Austin, who teaches lawyering process and advanced legal research at the University of Denver Stern School of Law. She has both a JD and a PhD.
Good afternoon. I'm here to talk to you a little bit about the neuroscience of cognitive wellness. And there is a theory of body intelligence known as BQ, and it's divided into 3 pillars: awareness of your body, listening to your body, knowledge of your health literacy, and then having a plan, engaging in a plan for optimum health. What I want to talk to you today about is NQ, or neurointelligence. So awareness to the needs of our brain, and learning more about our brain and what we can do to keep our brain healthy, which I'm calling neural self-hacking, which is a term from a gentleman who works at Google. So a little bit about the brain. Our brain weighs 3 pounds. It's shaped like a walnut. It's the size of a coconut. It's the consistency of Jell-O, or for the vegetarians, tofu. It uses a lot of our resources. It uses a lot of our oxygen, our food, and our blood flow. I'm going to focus on the emotional brain and the thinking brain. And Ken has already told us that our brain evolved from our spine upward. So I'm going to focus on the top 2/3 of that, the emotional brain in the middle and our thinking brain on top. So our emotional brain, in particular, I want us to learn about the amygdala, which is our brain's panic button, and I've already talked to Ken, he needs to learn more about the amygdala, and the hippocampus, which is our brain's processor of memories. And when we are engaging our emotional brain, we're having an emotional response, or we're laying down a memory. Our thinking brain is that walnutty piece up here. If we spread it out, it would be the shape of a baby blanket, or for those of us who still remember, a newspaper. It has 2 hemispheres, you've probably heard about that, 4 lobes, and it's engaged when you use higher order thinking. In our brain, where it's made up of neurons, or communication nerve cells, and they're shaped like trees. And so the top of the tree is the branches, those are the dendrites, and information travels through our neurons, down the dendrites into the trunk, which is the axon, and then down to a little gap called the synapse. And at the synapse, a chemical, neurotransmitter, helps that information travel chemically to the next neuron, to the next set of dendrites. So it's chemical, it's electrical in the neuron, chemical in the neurotransmitter, and so on. There are over 100 neurotransmitters that have been identified. We're going to focus on just a few in our brain health presentation today. But this is a very optimistic situation for legal educators, for law students, and for lawyers, because our brain is constantly changing, which means we can impact our change for the positive. Our brain is our own unique set of neural patterns. One author has defined that as our connectome, and this is very optimistic because our personal behavior and the environments that we create can have an impact on brain health. So a little bit about the learning brain. The learning brain is made up of both the thinking brain, so the top, and the emotional brain, in particular the amygdala and the hippocampus. So we start to lay down a memory through the encoding process. And in the encoding process, information enters our thinking brain through our senses, through the 4 lobes that control our senses, and those are memory traces. That information then gets shuttled to the emotional brain, and one of 2 pathways becomes engaged. So the quick and dirty pathway is through the amygdala. The amygdala is concerned about our survival, and it's concerned about emotional content. So it is trying to figure out, is there danger? The slower, more deliberative method is to go through our hippocampus. And so this is where we can access prior learning, access other memories, and make effortful processing and make decisions in that way. The next step is consolidation, and this is a really interesting process that scientists are still learning about. They think that the consolidation process to transfer memories from memory traces to be stable in the brain and long-term memory can take between 2 and 10 years. So that's a pretty long time and a pretty big range of time. This process takes place largely during sleep. Our memories travel a neural loop from the thinking brain to the emotional brain and the hippocampus in particular, and then keep traveling this loop, thinking brain, emotional brain, thinking brain, emotional brain. And so that's where our memory is for 2 to 10 years. So that's where our students are accessing information on law school assessments, is in this neural loop because of the time frame. Once our memories are fully consolidated, our thinking brain lets go of its relationship with the hippocampus, and then our memories are fully consolidated and stored in our connectomes. So they're all up in our thinking brain, in our very unique neural patterns that we have in each of our connectomes. The stressed brain is what I've been experiencing ever since my son flew off a ski jump yesterday at a Colorado resort and decided not to land properly. And so we have several different types of stress. We have the acute stress that I was experiencing while I was trying to learn from all of you in the conference and authorize X-rays. And that helps us marshal resources for a unique intellectual challenge or a physical challenge like a 5K. And then there's long-term stress. That's chronic stress. That's a troubled relationship with your significant other. That's job loss. That's maybe law school. And in this process, our autonomic nervous system becomes engaged, and it's divided into 2 parts. Ken talked to us a little bit about fight or flight. That's one part, that's the sympathetic nervous system. The other part is the parasympathetic nervous system, or the rest and digest. So what happens when we get our fight or flight system lit up is that our stress hormones produce a lot of negative physical effects and impacts on our brain as well. Our blood pressure goes up, our digestion is suppressed. We are trying to marshal resources to survive when this happens. The fight or flight overdrive that arguably we might all be subject to in Western culture, law students might be subject to pretty continuously in law school, creates a lot of negative physical impacts, a lot of negative emotional impacts, but it also has a pretty significant impact on our hippocampus, which remember is our memory processor. So when we're trying to learn in an intense environment, we need a healthy hippocampus. Well, our hippocampus is highly susceptible to stress hormones. There are many, many receptors of stress hormones in our hippocampus, and what happens is the birth of new brain cells, which takes place only in our hippocampus and our olfactory lobes, is suppressed, and our hippocampus can shrink and cells can even die in the process of having stress hormones, having it bathed in stress hormones. This explains why our cognition deteriorates. This explains why we have loss of memory, concentration, problem solving, and then things like creativity. Hippocampi have been shown to shrink in people with PTSD, people with depression, and people who are subject routinely to jet lag. So what we really want to do is be able to amplify our rest and digest system. This is the system that helps us use our food resources appropriately. It helps conserve our energy, and so we want to empower that system to help our brain. So what is the prescription? The prescription is a plan for neural self-hacking. And this plan, to empower your learning brain, you want a very healthy hippocampus. The very best thing you can do for that is aerobic exercise of some sort. You want to enhance memory consolidation. The best thing you can do for that is get adequate and healthful sleep. And then you want to enhance your rest and digest system. And you can do that through a series of contemplative practices, most of which have been mentioned already in our presentations. So let's start with the hippocampus, what we can do. This is aerobic exercise. This is anything that raises your heart rate. So anything that you participate in, from a brisk walk to running to swimming, whatever it happens to be, this helps increase the blood flow. It helps increase the amount of oxygen, and we know the brain really needs those things. It also increases and balances key wellness neurotransmitters, such as dopamine, serotonin, and GABA. And it also stimulates a very particular, powerful protein called brain-derived neurotrophic factor, BDNF for short. So BDNF is like a miracle grow for our hippocampus. It promotes the birth of new brain cells. It helps protect existing brain cells. It also promotes synapses formation. The most powerful way you can enhance your BDNF protein is aerobic exercise. You can also do calorie reduction, which works in mice, but maybe not so much for us. Also curcumin and omega-3 fat. So the most compelling performance impact research is that international test of math and science skills that our kids take, and a Chicago suburb changed their PE program from a sports-based to a fitness-based program in the 1990s, and the kids were evaluated on how much time they spent with an increased heart rate. And 97% of their 8th graders took this test on math and science. They got 1st in science, 6th in math, when overall US students got 18th and 19th in those subjects. Next to memory consolidation and sleep. Sleep and memory consolidation takes place during the REM cycle of sleep. So when you get 8 hours of sleep, you are able to get in 4 REM cycles. Your amygdala and hippocampus are as active or more when you're in REM sleep, and the memory consolidation genes are activated. The sleep research shows significant cognitive decline when you miss a night of sleep or when you shortchange with multiple nights of short hours of sleep. And to become an amygdala whisperer, you want to add contemplative practices to your world. You've heard about mindfulness. One great exercise to think of is saying to yourself, just drive. You know how your fight or flight system gets immediately amped up when somebody cuts you off in traffic? So what you need to tell yourself is focus on your senses, the steering wheel, Sinatra on the radio, focus on the road ahead of you and getting to your destination. Just drive. Meditation. We have experienced meditation, which is awesome for me. I needed that before my son's crash. The research on mindfulness and meditation shows numerous mental health and physical health benefits, and including empowering your immune system and helping learning and thinking. Yoga. Yoga is extremely powerful in that it increases GABA, which is the neurotransmitter of calm. It uses both, it involves both your fight or flight and your rest and digest system. It can train your brain that symptoms of fight or flight, which are increased heart rate and respiration rate, can be beneficial to your body and used for good. I heard a comedian say that yoga is so hard it should have a safety word. I'm not sure it's that hard, but I'm going to practice. I'm going to practice neuroplasticity. It's very powerful for women. You'll see this study results on reducing metabolic rate, 8% in men, but 18% in women. And finally, gratitude. You've heard a number of people speak about gratitude practice, but the research of over 100 studies shows that this can impact positive emotions, accomplishment of your goals, and even longevity. So the takeaway that I'd like to leave you with is that personal choices and environments matter because of the power of neuroplasticity, our ability to enhance our brain through some of these practices. So thank you very much for your time.
Our next speaker is Emily Zimmerman. She's an associate professor of law at Drexel University, and her scholarship focuses on legal education.
So I'm grateful for such helpful co-panelists who helped me with my PowerPoint slides, which is awesome. Being here for this conference really is like winning the jackpot. I figure I would have to use one Las Vegas metaphor here in my speech, but that's it. Don't worry, there aren't any more. So really thank you for such a phenomenal conference and for giving me the opportunity to be a part of it. It's just been absolutely awesome. So I'm going to talk about grit in the context of legal education and law students, and I'm going to talk about an empirical research project that I've been working on with my two co-investigators, who I am very grateful for. So Nancy and Deborah both talked about listing 3 things that you are grateful for, or 3 people you are grateful for. So here are my first 3 people who I am grateful for. So Leah Brogan is one of my co-investigators, and Leah is a grad student in the psych department at Drexel, and Eli Sukiyama is my other co-investigator, and Eli is a postdoctoral fellow at Penn in the psychology department. And Jerry Arison I have to give a shout out to because he is our graphic design genius at the law school, and I am far from a graphic design genius, so Jerry and I have spent countless hours together working on some of the graphics that you'll see later on. There are not many because I am not a graphic design genius by any stretch. And the work that we've been doing looks at grit, as I said, and grit, as I'm using it, is based on Angela Duckworth and her colleagues' definition of grit, which is passion and perseverance for long-term goals. And I am also extremely grateful for Angela that when I emailed her out of the blue saying, I'm a few blocks down the road from you and I'm very interested in your research, she actually responded to my email and put me in touch with her, one of the other grad students in her lab who's her research assistant, Laura Gasparis Winkler, who I met with and then was able to work with Eli as a result of that. So they've been just fantastically helpful. So I am extremely grateful for them. And finally, last but not least, very grateful for my amazing colleagues at Drexel who actually encouraged me to do this research. So Nancy talked about working with people who you like and trust, and I am just unbelievably thankful that I get to work with people who I like and trust all the time, which is phenomenal. Highly recommend. So the way that I got to this research on grit and my interest in grit is that I initially, several years ago now, was very interested in the idea of law student enthusiasm. And there's a lot of literature on legal education which basically boils down to law students come to law school and they're very enthusiastic, and then in not so short order, the enthusiasm gets beaten out of them, and then they are completely demoralized and not enthusiastic. And the literature didn't really define what was meant by law student enthusiasm. So I naively thought that I would look at the psych literature and I would find a definition of learner enthusiasm, and I could talk about how that definition could be applied to the law school context. And what I found was, of course, it's never that easy, right? So it wasn't that easy. So I found two different constructs in the psych literature that really resonated to me together to form a good operational definition of law student enthusiasm. So one of those constructs was interest, which has been written about by Heidi and Renninger, and basically they have this idea that there is a 4-phase model of interest development, which basically starts with what's called triggered situational interest. So basically, something grabs your attention and you attend to it, but it might be brief, and when you're distracted from it, you might not ever go back to it. So it's just this external stimulus, attracts your attention, but it might be short-lived and you might not pursue it any further. But then in this 4-phase model, interest can develop to become ultimately internalized and something that an individual will pursue and persevere with in the face of challenge, and it's a much more internalized identification with a particular activity or topic of interest. So that seemed to resonate as part of this idea of law student enthusiasm. So an interest for law study, an interest for law practice, and this idea of interest sort of embodies these ideas of having knowledge about a particular topic or activity and value for a particular topic or activity. And then the other construct that resonated with me was this idea of subjective vitality, and Ryan and Frederick have done research in that area. And subjective vitality captures this idea of a subjective feeling of aliveness or energy, which captures in a way sort of the more colloquial idea that I think people have with enthusiasm, which is the sense of energy about particular activity, but to me did not fully capture what we think about when we talk about law student enthusiasm, because it's not just sort of this, I'm so energetic, right? It's this identification and interest in wanting to continue and pursue something in the face of challenge when you might not be exhibiting a lot of perhaps external energy, but there's the sense of persistence. And so my initial piece was not empirical at all, but I wrote about interest and vitality as constructs that might help us better understand law student enthusiasm. And one of my hypotheses was that, well, perhaps one of the issues with legal education is that we are presuming that law students come to law school with a much more developed level of interest for law study and law practice than they actually have. And perhaps what we need to do is prioritize cultivating enthusiasm for law study as opposed to assuming that students have it when they come to law school and then being dismayed when they seem to lose it, right? So maybe they're not losing it, maybe they just don't have it the way we think they have it when they come to law school. And perhaps there's a disconnect between law professors who obviously we kind of like law school because we continue to be in law school. We like what we teach, we like what we study. Sometimes I think we think that it's so intrinsically interesting, how could we possibly have to make it interesting for people? But maybe that's part of the problem, is that we think what we do is so interesting that when we're teaching about it, maybe we need to work harder to make it more interesting to our students. So that was sort of my initial foray into the world of enthusiasm. And one of my other conclusions was we need to have more empirical research with law students because there really hasn't been all that much empirical research with law students. And so when I started reading about Angela Duckworth's research and her colleagues as well, their research on grit really resonated with the reading that I had done and the thinking that I had done about law student enthusiasm. And Angela works in the Positive Psychology Center at Penn, where Marty Seligman also is, so this is sort of the Positive Psychology Center all the time panel. But one things. Although there is a growing interest in the application of positive psychology to legal education, there has been very, 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 very little empirical research with law students applying some of the constructs of positive psychology to law students. And the research that's been done with GRIT that Angela Duckworth and her colleagues has done has focused on GRIT as a predictor of performance, but there has not been research that's been done with GRIT and law students or with legal education. And so the work that Angela Duckworth and her colleagues has done has found that GRIT is correlated with undergraduate GPA for undergrads. She's done work at West Point, and they found that GRIT predicted students or incoming cadets retention, that cadets with higher levels of GRIT were more likely to complete the initial summer training program for cadets at West Point. Interestingly, they found that GRIT actually didn't predict first-year academic GPA once cadets stayed after that first summer program, but they did find that it predicted retention. So they've looked at GRIT in a few different contexts, but not with respect to law students. So given that GRIT is passion and perseverance for long-term goals, and that law school is challenging and requires a sustained level of effort and commitment, I was really interested to see how GRIT would play out in the context of legal education. And so we designed a study which administered the GRIT scale, which is a 12-item measure, but 6 of the items on the scale actually assess GRIT. And we administered this to actually recent law school graduates. And so the survey was administered in August of 2013, and it was administered to recent law school graduates. And our hypotheses were that GRIT would be correlated with law school GPA, and we were also looking at bar passage. The numbers with bar passage, I'm not going to dwell on, because we actually, happily, there were obviously a very small number of students who actually didn't pass the bar. So it makes it a little harder to draw too many conclusions with respect to that. But we were looking at the relationship between GRIT and law school GPA and GRIT and bar passage. And so what we found was that there was actually not a relationship between GRIT and law school GPA, so there was not a statistically significant correlation between GRIT and law school GPA, and it doesn't look like there was a statistically significant correlation between GRIT and bar pass, but like I said, the numbers there are quite small as far as numbers who didn't pass the bar. So we had a total sample size of 49. Obviously, it's a small sample size. It is a study at just one law school, so it'll be very interesting to conduct more research with student or recent graduates at different law schools, and also, obviously, to have more participants. This also was a not a prospective study, so we weren't assessing GRIT at the beginning of law school and then seeing how it predicted law school GPA. So we're hoping to continue to do research with law students and GRIT in the future. So we found unexpected results that GRIT wasn't related to law school GPA, and so that raises questions about GRIT and law school, none of which obviously we can answer, but it's always fun to have more questions to look into, so we are happy that we have more questions to look into. One is, if it is in fact the case that GRIT is not related to law school GPA, then one question is there a problem with the way we're assessing students in law school, that students who are grittier are not actually performing better as far as their graded performance in law school? And there are other questions with respect to, well, even if GRIT weren't related to law school GPA, is GRIT related to satisfaction with law school or satisfaction with law practice? So if you assessed GRIT with practicing lawyers, would there be a relationship with satisfaction, with long-term continuation in the profession? etc. And then it raises questions about the grit scale too, so querying whether law students or recent law school graduates in particular are just a generally gritty population of people, and query whether recent law school graduates who actually take a survey in August are particularly gritty over and above your average gritty law student, right? So we also, which we didn't have hypotheses about, but since this was really the first exploration of grit in the context of legal education, it was exploratory as well. So we ended up comparing responses to the individual items on the grit scale of men and women, and we also ended up comparing overall grit score of men and women. And there was no statistically significant difference between the law school GPAs of men and women, but what we did find, which we actually had no expectation of finding, was that women actually had overall grit scores that were higher to a statistically significant degree than men. So the average grit score for women overall was 4.05. The average grit score for the males was 3.50. Standard deviations are in parentheses. And then, this is obviously really hard to read if you're up there, but there were certain differences between men and women of individual items on the grit scale. So the gold line is the overall mean, the blue is the mean for women, and then the orange is the mean for men. And so women actually had higher scores, so evidenced more grit for a bunch of different items. So one was, I've been obsessed with a certain idea for a short time, but later lost interest. That's reverse scored. Another one was, I am diligent. People say I'm an extremely hard worker. I often set a goal, but later choose to pursue a different one. That was also reverse scored. And I have difficulty maintaining my focus on projects that take more than a few months to complete, also reverse scored. And then the total grit score for men and women was also different, with women having higher overall grit scores. So that was certainly not an expected result. And again, just raises more questions really than it answers as far as whether that's a finding that would be replicated with a larger population, whether that's a finding that would be replicated with lost students. It's a finding that wouldn't have surprised me if we were doing this research a little bit more in the past, right? When you would expect that women who went to law school and completed law school would perhaps have to be grittier, right? My mom went to law school and graduated in 1956. There were, women in the single digits in her law school class, right? And even more recently than that. I don't think these results would necessarily be terribly surprising. But now, it wasn't something that we expected to find. So again, the good news is there's lots more research to be done in this area, and there's a ton more to learn. And this was just our initial exploration of grit in the context of legal education. So thank you very much.
Our next speakers are Peter Wang and Corey Lynn Rosen, both at the University of Colorado School of Law. Peter has a JD from Stanford and a PhD in applied math. And Corey previously taught at Arizona State University for a number of years.
All true. I'm going to try to walk around a little bit. So, we're your last speakers, and we're grateful to Jean and to the conference. I especially love that there was coffee all day long. I'm aggressively drinking it all day long, so thank you for facilitating that for me. We are going to talk about some of the same things that the other panelists have talked about, but we're going to frame them a little bit differently. So you may not be aware of this, but while we've been sitting in this room, a crisis has been ongoing. It's not a crisis of weather here, fortunately, but it is a significant crisis, and it affects all of us. The crisis we are here to talk to you about is the crisis of the zombie lawyer apocalypse. It's a real phenomenon. Some of you may have observed it firsthand. We have many zombified lawyers roaming the streets. If you live in an urban area, you may have seen this while you're out on foot. If you live in a more suburban area, you may have locked your doors and rolled up your windows to protect yourself from the roaming zombies, who may or may not look a little bit more like this. And there are some different ways, some very specific ways that legal zombies present. So the conceit of our presentation is we want to give you the tools to identify these zombies within, right, a hair's breadth of certainty, so you can, one, run for cover, and two, possibly engage in some practices to reverse the zombification process and maybe even prevent the birth of some zombies. So in this scenario, which is somewhat imagined, but in many ways true, you are, right, the freedom fighter on the side of good, protecting not only yourself, but the public. And it's very important to be able to recognize these zombies. And so they look like this. They're dispirited, disengaged, mindless. They have a herd mentality, though they don't always roam in packs, right? And they experience a profound lack of meaning, both in the work that they do and in their relationships with other people. And then, of course, the telltale sign, eating the flesh of the living. We suggest you run if you see that particular thing. So this is, I don't know if you can see this, this is if you've encountered a zombie lawyer in negotiation, perhaps in a settlement context, the zombie lawyer's main strategy is typically to attempt to eat your brain. So be careful. There is a very real toll on us remaining humans, those of us who have survived the apocalypse unscathed and who wish to continue on in human form. I certainly fit that description, and I hope that you do too. If you are actually a zombie, please stand and leave the room, I should have said, I guess. No takers. I should use silence, I guess. All right, I'm convinced. So, the human toll of zombification is, of course, first and foremost, dehumanization, right? These zombie lawyers or zombie law students have become something else, something other than totally human. They're depressed because they're no longer human, and they exhibit other signs of psychological distress. So there's a rich and very dispiriting literature on the ways that we dehumanize our students and the ways that lawyers become dehumanized, and we're going to talk about this process a little bit. And we know that the effect is harm to clients, because when zombies are making decisions, they're not thinking through problems as effectively as humans might. And this can lead to larger societal dysfunction because we have zombies in lots of institutions. I know we talked a little about legislatures last night, so this may have a deeper ring of truth if you think about it in that context. So these are some of the roots of the apocalypse. We are focused primarily on law school because that's where we're encountering human beings who then become zombies, and some zombies perhaps who show up on day one, we're not sure. And it's a great point of intervention. So that's our primary focus, although we'll talk a little bit about how this manifests in the practice context. So we know, right, Sheldon and Krieger have talked a lot about lack of autonomy, the way law school takes autonomy away from students, renders them, or at least makes them feel powerless, puts them in direct competition with their peers so that they feel, instead of related to one another as members of a community, directly competitive with the members of their community, which makes them feel less supported. We ability label them. This comes from Carol Dweck's literature, right? We say, you're an A, you get to live as a human. You're a B, you have to kill yourself, right? And that is, right, I'm exaggerating, but to some extent that actually is what our students hear. And then they carry this ability labeling with them forward. It has two serious problems that we'll talk about a little bit later. Elizabeth Mertz has written about the language of the law, the way we attack or at least question the values of our students and in some ways undermine them in that process. So it's not the questioning that's the problem, it's the undermining that's the problem. And then of course learned pessimism or learned helplessness. So what we get is this. We are producing anxiety and stress like that. So folks come in looking pretty human and they come out looking like the hairy lion. And a lot of people have talked about this stress curve, that there's like this optimal area under the curve where we want to experience some stress because a little bit of stress is good and motivating, right? We don't want to live in a totally stress-free world where we're all just like mollusks hanging around on the beach. It doesn't work out that well for the mollusks typically. But we don't want so much stress that we're in constant fight or flight, panic all the time. The truth is actually that it's not a static curve, right? Different people experience different stresses in different ways. The first time you come to a conference and give a talk, maybe you're petrified. After you've done it 50 or 60 times, maybe you're not petrified anymore. Maybe you need a lot more input to get to motivating stress, right? Or maybe you're just at a healthy stress point. So it's very relative. And we want to think about providing an environment, crafting an environment that doesn't zombify our students, but also doesn't throw too many of the students too far off their personal stress curve.
Okay, and it's just not just stress, it's what Deborah already talked about, right? It's let's see, chronic stress, right? Long-term stress, which is an environmental mismatch because that's not what we're sort of evolved for. We're evolved for sort of isolated instances of stress, as opposed to this continuing, ongoing, almost daily stress that a lot of law students experience. And it's in some sense similar to commuting, right? There's a lot of research showing that long and dense commutes lead to a lot of bad health and psychological outcomes. So it sort of raises the question whether law schools in some sense like long and dense commutes, which are bad for us, right? And in particular, it fosters bad habits about lots of things that law students acquire and go on to continue in their practice and in the other areas of their lives besides their professional lives. So bad habits about eating, about emotions, about lack of exercise, about managing stress, about balance, right? One of the questions that people have already raised is what can we do to sort of not have law students shift from intrinsic to extrinsic motivations, right? So Todd Peterson's written about this, Larry Krieger, Ken Sheldon, and basically the solution that we're proposing is to stop zombifying our law students, right? So law students essentially develop sort of mindsets and practices that are not good for them, and we can try to intervene. And so a number of law schools are very engaged in curricular innovations to try to help law students realize the importance of emotional intelligence, mindfulness, well-being, the stuff that Rob's talked about. So I think there's a growing movement, right, that we can do something instead of just sitting by idly. And the other question is, sometimes law students develop these bad habits, sometimes they remain okay, but law practice itself then either triggers or sort of is the sort of catalyst for these bad habits coming to the surface, or law practice itself has other reasons or causes of zombification, including some of the same ones that we mentioned before already, right? Lack of autonomy, lack of control. Gina and Jennifer's paper on behavioral legal ethics talks about some of these tolls of legal practice, right? Law from culture, hierarchy. There's research about decision fatigue, cognitive overload, we've talked about already. Seligman and some others talked about just the zero-sum nature of adversarial litigation. But it's obviously not just litigation. I mean, people in transactional or other areas still sometimes exhibit some of the same triggers for zombification. So one point is to have prevention and treatment, right? So both as a way to sort of prevent zombification and as a way to sort of maybe reverse or treat people who become zombified is to do the stuff that Nancy talks about in her book with Doug, to try to encourage law students to become less of a zombie. Right?
So we want to interrogate a little bit this question, what is happiness? Because our thesis is, in essence, that we can use some of these happiness interventions to prevent or treat zombification. And so there are lots of different researchers who define happiness in lots of different ways. It's a very problematic word, but it turns out to be a great word if you want to sell books, right? So we need to define it, and that wasn't personal. Anyway, I think the work that we're doing is really important, but what happens, I think, to the public is that they take happiness at face value and they think it means feeling good all the time. And we know that's not the way anyone really intends to use the word, at least not anyone in this room, right? Because you have to take an oath before you leave. So this momentary happiness or pleasure, this positive emotion, is a component of happiness. It's a real thing, right? So you come to this conference, you feel, I hope as I feel, oh my goodness, there are all these people who are interested in what I'm interested in. What a lovely place to be. The weather in Vegas is so great. And I feel happy. And I drink a lot of coffee, which contributes to it. And then there's life satisfaction or contentment, the sense that what I do matters, what I do has meaning and dimension beyond my immediate emotional state. I'm having an impact, it's profound, and it's outside of me. That's really related to meaning. It ties in with contentment, so there's some overlap in those two areas. And there's some other metrics that people have talked about. Seligman, in what I think is an attempt to unify his life's work, has come up with PERMA, which is sort of a map to understand all the stuff that he's done before PERMA, and I know Rob touched on PERMA. But so PERMA takes positive emotion and incorporates it. This is like a factors test is how I think about this, so forgive me. So you don't need all of these things all the time, but you do need all of them in some amount to some degree. So engagement, this is flow, doing work that grabs you and holds you deeply. Positive relationships, so this is this idea of relatedness in self-determination theory. Meaning and accomplishment, which is actually achievement for achievement's sake, because as we in this room know, sometimes it really feels good to win. And so he's taken these things together as a unified theory. So he started at a slightly different place and has come to the PERMA theory. And there are lots of positive psychology interventions, cultivating optimism, we've talked about gratitude, increasing flow, nurturing social relationships, practicing acts of kindness, and savoring life's joys. Quickly, I'm just going to say this for those of you who are sitting here skeptically thinking, how could I become happier? That seems silly. It is true, and you've probably heard this like on NPR, half of your happiness set point is dictated by your genes. And the other half is dictated by a combination of it's 40% outlook and 10% circumstance. So sometimes it feels like this. This is one woman talking to another, and the one woman says, it's very easy. The first step is to entirely change who you are. And that's not what we are suggesting. What we're suggesting is that we have some control over this 40%, and that we should be, both for ourselves and for our students and for practitioners, teaching and encouraging an idea that it's important to take control of that 40%.
So actually in that study on sustainable change, they actually use 3 different ways to measure happiness. One is frequent positive affect. Another is high life satisfaction, which is sort of more cognitive, all things considered, how do I evaluate my life? And also infrequent negative affect. So one of the things this raises is, of course, what is the definition of happiness? And so because people disagree about what's the way to measure happiness, including PERMA, one idea is to try to look for interventions or look for ways to boost happiness that actually boost more than one kind of happiness. So these are several things that we've already talked about, other people in Spanish talked about, either lead to higher positive affect or higher life satisfaction. Sleep, exercise, meditation, right? So there's a lot of interest in meditation right now. We've talked about mindfulness meditation. That's the book that Search Inside Yourself that Deborah mentioned. So there's also another payoff, right? So there's research showing that people whose mind wander tend to be unhappy, and vice versa. And also people who are ethical are happy about it. People who are unhappy tend to behave unethically. And finally, people who are mindful tend to be ethical, right? And people who are mindless, because they're not, this is in some sense a lot of the behavioral economics is about this. If you're not mindful, you're not going to behave ethically, not because of intentional purposefulness, just because you really don't pay attention, or you can see the ethical elements of the decisions you're facing. So this is a book about creating meaning in life, right? And so it's related to the meaning element in PERMA. And one question I think we can do, or one thing we can do in law school, is to sort of reframe what the identity that lawyers have of themselves, as opposed to just being litigators or transaction cost engineers, to frame it a different way, because identity affects people's behavior. How they see themselves can affect how they make choices and even affect their preferences. So these are some of the identities that we suggest that we might be trying to communicate to our students to make them less likely to be prone to become zombies. And the last slide is, this is a movie called More Bodies, And the idea is reverse notification. And so the idea is what makes you feel alive. I think some of the things we talked about, mindfulness, being happy, these are things that can make you feel alive and hopefully prevent notification or reverse notification. So I'll stop there.
Okay, so we have some time for questions. Yes. Would you like the mic?
No,
Okay.
One of his, Howard Gardner has done some very interesting work on what he calls the good work project. And his thesis is that good work consists of work that is technically excellent, ethical in the sense of serving community, the community in which you're involved, whether it's the legal community at large, and also engaging. And I'm just curious if any of the panelists have tried to put Howard Gardner's work up against Seligman's work, because Seligman has not picked up, maybe in the context of meaning, but has not picked up what you just talked about, Peter, about the ethical dimension of why that's important. And maybe excellence is assumed under achievement, but I'd be interested to know whether there's any comment on that.
So I guess one thing to say is, I think you're right. Seligman, I think, wants to be agnostic about what it is that creates meaning. And some people criticize this for saying, like, while it's commendable as a scientist or psychologist saying you want to be agnostic, sort of you're avoiding sort of a values discussion, right? And I think that's what you're saying. I mean, this idea of having broader meaning is related to this. But I'm not aware of any sort of, anybody working on sort of connecting these two ideas. Yeah.
I'm not either. I think self-determination theory gets a little bit closer, but it's still different again. And I do think the reason is that, right, Seligman talks very directly in his last book about achievement for achievement's sake, and he goes out of his way to say the pursuit of money solely will not affect well-being, right? That you need other dimensions of PERMA. But I didn't think, perhaps others disagree, he doesn't say, right, the pursuit of achievement for achievement's sake is something we should avoid unless that achievement is, colored by meaning or some deeper, more profound engagement with the community. He really carved it out separately. And one of the reasons I think is that he's trying to be objective and look at how people behave and then what they report in terms of how much well-being do they experience, and using subjective measures. So I agree that there are some problems here and it can be a little bit tangled up, but I have not tried to fix it. And I don't know of anyone who currently is, but it's a really interesting question.
Thank you for all of your presentations. I've learned some really great things from all of them, and I especially love the zombie idea as an analogy for describing this issue. So Peter and Corey, I wondered, when you talk about not making our students into zombies, I think that's really key, and a lot of the things that I think that we deal with here is treating the symptoms of students after they become zombies. And this is probably beyond the scope of what we're doing here, but I just wonder, as long as we have the grading system in law schools that we do, if we're ever going to stop students from becoming zombies, it seems to me, in my experience as a law student and now in teaching law, that's one of, the major causes of why students are the way they are, and I'm not sure. I guess, I wonder your response. Do you also share that sense that grades are kind of our grading system is at the root of this, and are we going to perpetually be trying to deal with the symptoms as long as that system is in place?
So my sense is that places that don't have strict grading curves have happier students, less stressed out students, less zombified students. That being said, my sense is also it's going to be hard to change that at a lot of places. And so it's related to, I think, this view of stress is in some sense unavoidable, both in law school and legal practice. That being said, I think unproductive stress isn't something we want to minimize. So I think one of the things we're saying is, while it would be great to try to change legal education more fundamentally, that's not going to happen quickly or cheaply or overnight. So I think some of the things we and the other kind of talk about are ways to help people become resilient or to manage stress or cope effectively, deal better with the stress, which are which don't require the entire faculty to buy in or are not as expensive to do. I guess that's.
Yeah, I recently ran across someone who was using this language that I'm now trying to adopt in talking to myself, which is that you could fail without being a failure. And so because I think the system is, we're moving, I think, in the right direction in some ways, and this is not a faculty meeting about grade inflation, so I don't want to take us there. But I do think that if we build a system in which only 10% of the students have the opportunity to perceive themselves as succeeding, then we can do two things. We can reframe what it means to be successful, particularly in an economy where at many of our schools, or many of our students are not going on to big law practices because it's simply not really available to them. And two, I think when students perceive themselves as having failed, we can make that okay instead of taboo. We can make it a learning experience and tell them that, right, they can have failed without themselves, right, without personalizing it, without being a failure, and then reframe and go back and try to give them the skills that they need to take the next steps to be more successful. And so maybe then it's about this journey rather than about, A, B, C, this sort of ability labeling that I think is problematic.
And I've actually done a little bit of empirical research with law students about grades. And so I did find that students certainly expect to get better grades than they end up getting, which is not shocking. And that getting good grades is very important to students. They report that it is anyway. But I was also interested to see whether there was a difference in students' attitudes about law school based on whether they did better or worse than they expected or based on their grades, and maybe this also reflects an optimism bias, but students don't necessarily say that they are looking forward to continuing in law school less when they've gotten worse grades as opposed to students who've gotten better grades. So I think that there was some discussion about transparency earlier. I think being transparent with students about grading is also very important because I think students' perceptions is that the curve makes them get worse grades than they would otherwise get because they all think, well not all, but they think that they're going to get better grades than they get. So I think it's easy for them to think they got worse grades because of the curve, whereas I think if you ask law professors think that the curve actually forces grades up, and that if law professors were grading pursuant to objective criteria, whatever that means, that students might actually end up all getting worse grades than they would otherwise get. So I don't think that the curve is necessarily as horrible in practice as it seems like it is in theory. I think in some ways it might make law professors grade more realistically because you're grading relative to the person who does the best in the class as opposed to your completely outlandish notions of what law students are supposed to be able to do. So I'm not an apologist for grading, but I don't think it's quite as horrific as it's sometimes made out to be. And I don't think law students necessarily think that it is either, although certainly there's a lot of stress attendant to grading.
I'm very concerned about the way we assess students and the impact on their stress and their learning capacity. I'm interested in looking at what students report are their stress levels and their sources of stress, and then connecting that to the level of stress hormones, maybe in their urine or their saliva, and then if I can get the money, what's happening to their hippocampus with scanning, and just to see what that would show.
I just had a comment, and that is that we're talking about them not ever failing, but most of the students who come in have never failed because they're the top of the top. They're used to being the smartest person in the room. They're used to all getting A's and A pluses. So I agree that we have to do it up front. In my property class, I tell them right at the beginning, before we even grade them, that you're all A's, and you have always been A's, and you're still an A. But in law school, we have to put you in some kind of hierarchy because that's what's required. So if you get the C, which is the first C they've ever seen in their life, and they equate it with death, they do accept that it normalizes it, is what it does. I tell them that you'll still graduate and you can still practice law, and I've never had a client say, what were your grades? But I see your transcript before I hire you. And I've heard back from students that that really helps them let go of in a panic when they got their grades where they did get C's and some of them got D's. So I think that it's not so much that they've never failed, it's that this is a novel experience for them to be with a whole bunch of very smart people. And I think we sometimes forget that.
Got 2 questions. First, I wonder if any of you know of any studies that are done at schools where they don't have grades, where they just have pass, fail, or high pass. Because I know anecdotally, I talked to some of the Harvard kids after Harvard got rid of grades, and they said it didn't make a difference to them because there was still a differentiation. So it was still a grade, even though it wasn't a letter grade. And then my second question is whether, and this is probably completely unrealistic, but whether there's anything out there that studied lawyer happiness or law student happiness way a few decades ago, because presumably most schools had grades at that point in time, and were they less happy? Is it probably grades, or is it that we just can't deal with them now, or what's the real issue? Go.
The oldest study I know is the Benjamin study from the 80s. Although some years ago I was speaking to the faculty at ASU, and one of our most difficult, most senior, sort of toughest guy in the room kind of faculty members came to my office after I had spoken, and I thought he was going to come in and tell me how I was all kinds of wrong. And what he said was, it's important to characterize these statistics and make sure that you're clear that the reason the result looks contemporary is because the studies are contemporary, because I think the findings have been, if you had studied, earlier generations, they would have found this. So that's anecdotal. I took it as gospel, so for what it's worth. And then your other question about grades, we've talked a little bit about this, and it seems to me that there aren't really any schools that don't use some kind of a proxy for hierarchy. So you pass, high pass, low pass is still ABC. And so I think that might explain why, because actually empirically, I think those schools, they're still producing distress in their law students. So.
I also know, just generally, I was going to say with statistics that the level of what was considered clinical anxiety, I was kind of racking my brain trying to think about where I read this, the author, 50 years ago is now like commonplace levels of anxiety, not just in law school, but in general. And in fact, when I'm at staff meetings at Counseling and Psychological Services at Northwestern as just a staff psychologist, our numbers are up in general, across the board. And if you talk to most directors of health and wellness centers, we're seeing higher rates of psychological issues across the board. That's one of the reasons I focus on the resilience issue. And I think you were kind of alluding to this in the other question when you were asking about, like, if you remove the grades, will this still be there? In some ways, it's not identifying your self-worth based on your outcome, whatever that is. That's why that intrinsic to extrinsic shift that happens in self-determination theory is so important. It's teaching them that it's about the process and these other values that they have, not so much the outcome. But yeah, there's definitely been a rise in mental health issues in general.
If I could take the grades issue and move to the next level, one of the reasons students worry about grades is because they link grades so significantly with jobs. And so part of the inoculation that Doug and I do with the first semester, first years, we certainly do the transparency thing and tell them that they fear that their whole law school career will feel like the first few weeks of the first semester of the first year of law school. And I explain that the remaining 5/6 will be better. I don't make guarantees, warranties, or promises of any kind. I'm a lawyer, but I feel very comfortable predicting that it will get better and that over the course of their careers it will get better. We talk about people who, and one of my favorite stories is a student who graduated, in her words, cum barely. And she was very interested in doing health law, which was done only on the defense side with large firms. we coached her to credential herself in health law as she was a student. She read the damn HIPAA regulations. She wrote a law review article, placed not in our law review, she didn't have the grades to get on, but she placed it in a good other journal, external journal. She interviewed, just informational interviews, the surrogation sort of thing, 30 people who were in the health law field. She started a health law society. She, in other words, created a job for herself because she took that passion and just committed herself to it. Find out what your students' passions are. Tell them to follow their own passions from the very beginning. Leap over the grades.
So this is a question of the whole panel. So we agree that we're creating some unhappy lawyers, unhappy law students. To what extent can we blame Christopher Columbus playing out? Or the whole idea of teaching with case method treats the law as science and rationality is king and logic is everything, and these emotional things are beneath us. And that's the way we've been teaching, and it's just started to change, I think, but it's been that way for an awfully long time. So isn't the solution here to just completely rethink the way we teach and get rid of the case method and start to acknowledge that the emotional brain is as important as the rational brain?
I mean, I think that's a common theme of this conference, right? That a lot of us here value this, exactly what Deborah went into a little bit more, that there really are two minds, that we've placed a premium on intellect and cognitive abilities for a really long time, and have pushed the emotional mind. We think of the emotional mind as like being emotional, as opposed to the importance of emotions in decision making and emotions in the courtroom and in your lawyering. And what she was talking about how fast there's a direct pathway from our senses to the amygdala, that we are actually thrown into kind of an emotional response before we are an intellectual response. That if we're not paying attention to that, then we can do a lot of things acting out of in our emotional mind that we're not even aware of. That's why the timeout works so good for my 3-year-old. Because I say, you're totally in your emotional mind right now. You need to just take 5 minutes for your thalamus to do the processing. Your neocortex needs to do a little bit of intellectual, rational processing to catch up. But she's got to learn. That's why mindfulness is so powerful too, in teaching people to have that awareness. Yeah.
I think you make an excellent point. One of the ways to affect change, and I got this from Tom Tyler and Randy Kaiser, is Tom said, how do you create legitimacy for anything? You point to the empirical information that works. Randy Kaiser showed us that in medical schools, they are testing for emotional intelligence as a competency. I would love to see the next McCrate report be all of us saying, emotional intelligence is a competency that lawyers must have. It will create good lawyers. It will create happy lawyers.
Wonderful way to end. Let's end it. An amazing, great perseverance and you have time to enjoy a little bit more of our weather before you go home. Let's not say goodbye. We'll say until the next time. Count on seeing each other at another event. So really.
Thank you.